The piercing sound of gunfire echoed through the alley, breaking the quiet of the evening. Officer John Harris stumbled, his vision blurred as blood poured from his shoulder. He tried to raise his gun, but his arms felt like lead, his strength draining away by the second. In the chaos, all he could hear was the frantic barking of his K-9 partner, Max, whose instincts had already kicked in. Max lunged forward, his body cutting through the air, determined to protect his partner at all costs. The officer's body was failing him, but his eyes were locked onto the one thing that could save him, Max's unwavering loyalty. As John collapsed to the ground, the world around him began to fade. His vision blurred, his pulse slowed, and the cold set in. But Max wasn't giving up. He was more than a partner. He was family. In a split second, with his owner on the brink of death, Max did something no one could have imagined. The question remained, could this incredible bond between officer and K-9 be enough to defy the odds? Time was running out, and what happened next would leave everyone speechless. What could a K-9 do in the face of death? Officer John Harris had seen it all. Over the years, he had been through countless high-risk operations, confronted dangerous criminals, and faced life-threatening situations. But through it all, there was one constant in his life: his K-9 partner, Max. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a part of John's life, a partner in the truest sense. The bond between them was unbreakable. Max had been with John for 5 years, and together they had become a formidable team. Their connection was one of mutual trust and understanding, a silent communication that had saved both their lives more times than they could count. The bond wasn't just about training or obedience. It was about respect, loyalty, and an unspoken promise to always protect each other. They were family. John often thought of Max as his second pair of eyes, his shield, and his friend. They had faced danger together, time and time again, but it was always the same. They survived because they trusted each other completely. Max had saved John's life on more than one occasion, and John had done the same for his dog. They were brothers in arms, bound by duty and honor, with no one else able to understand the depth of their relationship. Today, however, was different. It had started out as just another routine mission. The department had received a tip about a suspected drug deal in a warehouse on the edge of a town. John and Max had done this 100 times before. Arrive, assess the situation, apprehend the suspects, and return home. There was nothing about it that screamed danger. It seemed like a straightforward operation. But the moment they entered the warehouse, everything changed. Max's ears perked up, and John felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was off. He could feel it in the air. The silence was too heavy, the shadows too deep. John signaled to Max, and the K-9 instinctively stayed close to his side, alert and ready. They moved quietly through the warehouse, checking each corner with care. Then, out of nowhere, shots rang out. The first bullet hit John square in the shoulder. The pain was immediate, sharp, and debilitating. He staggered back, barely managing to stay on his feet as his body screamed for him to collapse. Max, his ever-vigilant partner, instantly reacted. He lunged forward, barking furiously, trying to protect his injured handler from the hail of bullets. But in the chaos, another shot rang out, striking John in the side. John's vision blurred as his legs weakened. He could feel himself losing control, but his mind was focused on one thing: getting Max out of harm's way. "Max!" he grunted, barely able to raise his voice. But the pain was overwhelming, and his legs gave way, sending him to the floor. Max whined in distress, his instincts kicking into overdrive. He refused to leave his partner's side, even as more shots were fired. He barked, trying to get help, trying to alert anyone who could come to their aid. But John knew that the pain was too much, and his time was running out. Through the haze of pain and fading consciousness, John reached out, his trembling hand finding Max's. He managed a weak smile, but even in the darkness that threatened to take him, he knew Max would never leave him. Not now, not ever. And then, just as John's world began to blur at the edges, he heard something he could never have expected. a bark, not of fear, but of purpose. Max's bark rang out, loud and clear, the K9's determination cutting through the chaos. Max had already seen John fall, had felt the shift in his partner's breath, but Max didn't hesitate. He wasn't just protecting himself or the officer. Max was going to do whatever it took to get his partner the help he so desperately needed. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a hero. The sound of the gunfire faded in John's ears as he slipped in and out of consciousness. He could feel Max's presence, steady and strong, pushing him to hold on just a little longer. Max would save him. There was no doubt in John's mind. The K9's instinct had always been sharp, and this time would be no different. But would it be enough? Would Max be able to save his partner, or would the officer's injuries be too great to overcome? The tension was unbearable as the seconds stretched on. Max's instincts and fierce loyalty to John were about to be put to the ultimate test. The world around Officer John Harris seemed to move in slow motion as he sank to the cold concrete floor of the warehouse. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, each inhale sharp and shallow. The blood pouring from his side was warm against the chill of the air, but it did little to ease the deep, aching cold in his chest. He knew he was in trouble. John's mind was foggy, his vision blurring around the edges as he fought to stay conscious. His right shoulder felt like it was on fire, and every breath sent a new wave of pain radiating through his entire body. He could hear Max barking somewhere in the distance, frantic, trying to alert help. The world around him was slipping away, but through the haze he could feel his K9 partner beside him. Max wasn't leaving him. John's head lolled to the side, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The gunshot wound in his side had punctured something vital, and blood was pooling beneath him. He could feel his body weakening with each passing second. The adrenaline that had once coursed through his veins began to dissipate, replaced by the cold, clammy grip of reality. He wasn't going to make it unless someone helped him, but no one was here. He and Max had entered the warehouse alone, and now he was paying the price for it. Max wasn't just his partner, he was his lifeline. John could barely move, but his hand still found the familiar warmth of Max's fur. He was still there. The K9 had positioned himself between John and the unseen danger, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any movement, his body taut with readiness. Max's paws were on the ground, bracing himself for the next step, waiting for any command from the officer. But John couldn't speak. The pain in his chest was suffocating, and his body was starting to shut down. Max's eyes were locked onto John's face, and for a brief moment their gaze met. John's hazy blue eyes meeting the sharp, intelligent brown of his partner. Max knew. There was no need for words, for commands. Max could sense it, the life draining from John's body. His handler was slipping, and Max's instincts screamed that something had to be done. But what? Max had been through training exercises, drills, and real-life situations where his job was to protect, track, and apprehend suspects. He had been taught to be a protector, a warrior, but no one had ever prepared him for this, how to save his partner's life. Max's ears flicked back as the realization hit him. John wasn't moving, wasn't giving orders, and his breathing was becoming more shallow with every second. Max whined softly, but there was no time for noise, no time for hesitation. The K9's instincts were screaming at him. Do something. Do anything. But Max didn't know what to do. He wasn't trained to perform miracles. Max stood frozen for a heartbeat, his chest tight with the confusion of his inner turmoil. His mind raced through every possible solution, but nothing felt right. He barked again, louder this time, hoping to catch the attention of anyone. Someone. Someone had to come. But even as Max barked, a part of him knew the truth. They were alone. Max turned back to his fallen partner, the weight of the officer's life bearing down on him. His K9 partner knew that if he didn't act quickly, it could be too late. John was no longer responding. His breaths were slow, uneven, and every time he exhaled, It seemed like there was less air coming out. It wasn't just the gunshot wounds, it was the blood loss. Max could smell the coppery tang of it in the air, the scent of death lingering just beyond his reach. The canine's instincts told him to keep barking, to find someone, to get help, but his heart told him to stay. John was his partner, his responsibility. The sound of sirens began to fade into Max's ears, but it was still too far off. Max's ears twitched as he heard the faintest rustle of footsteps, a reminder that someone else might be approaching. But it wasn't enough. Max growled softly, crouching low to the ground. His muscles tensed, the canine's body at the ready, but his mind still swirled with confusion. He knew he had to do something. What could he do? Max's gaze shifted back to John, whose eyes had grown dull, his face pale and bloodied. The officer's lips moved, but no words came out. Max could barely hear the faint whisper of a sound from John, as if he was trying to speak, trying to ask something of his partner. But the pain was too much. John had fallen into unconsciousness, and Max was left alone with the responsibility of saving his life. Max's tail twitched once. His instincts kicked in again. It was time to act. His nose hovered just above John's hand, and Max nudged the officer's fingers gently. Nothing. His body was cold. No response. But Max didn't give up. His nose moved down to John's face, and he began to nudge him again, this time more urgently. The canine whined softly, his body shaking with the effort. He couldn't do this alone. Max's body suddenly stiffened, and his sharp eyes darted across the warehouse. His keen sense of smell picked up something. Movement. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a faint silhouette in the dim light. Max froze, then barked with everything he had left, his voice louder, more urgent this time. The figure was closer, much closer now. It wasn't another enemy. It was help. Max's tail wagged weakly, but it wasn't over yet. His handler still needed him. Would the K9 know what to do in time? Would his instincts guide him to act before it was too late? Max stood motionless, his entire body taut with a mixture of fear and determination. His sharp eyes scanned the warehouse, every sense focused entirely on John. The situation had gone beyond anything he had trained for. This wasn't a simple apprehension, or an attack, or a chase. This was something far more serious. His handler's life was slipping away, and Max knew it. Max's instincts took over. They were honed through countless drills, through the thick of action where every movement counted. But this was different. There was no command to follow, no cue to act. It was just Max, alone, but not alone, because his partner's life was hanging in the balance. He could feel the weight of the officer's still body against the cold concrete beneath them, the warmth of the blood pooling around him. Max sniffed the air again, his nose twitching. No new scent. There was nothing he could identify. No one was coming. No one had been nearby. But then Max heard a sound, a faint rustle of movement from the far side of the warehouse. The canine's ears perked up, his body instantly rigid. He could hear the rapid breathing of his partner, and despite the quiet, he could feel John's heart beating slower, weaker. Max's body shifted slightly, his posture protective. Stay close. Stay near the officer. Max's training told him to be ready to confront any threat. He had seen the worst of the worst, facing down criminals with no second thoughts, his job to protect his partner at all costs. But now, he didn't need to fight someone else. He needed to save his handler. With a growl, Max moved cautiously toward the shadows, his paws light against the cold, hard concrete. He wasn't sure what was there, but the instinct to protect was too strong. Max stood there for a moment, sensing the danger around him. His nose twitched again as he picked up a new scent. It wasn't a threat. It was just the smell of the warehouse, the scent of oil, dust, and metal. Yet, even with his powerful nose, he couldn't find any trace of someone who might help. Max's eyes flicked back to John. The officer's breathing was shallow now, his chest rising and falling weakly. John was barely conscious, but his face was pale and streaked with sweat, his eyes half closed. Max padded closer to his partner, nudging John's arm gently with his nose, his movements deliberate but tender. He could feel the officer's faint pulse, and he instinctively let out a low whine, a sound of distress that echoed in the warehouse's empty space. Max paused, sitting next to John, pressing his side against the officer's body, offering what little warmth he could provide. There was no command in Max's mind. There was only the understanding that his partner needed him. The dog's instincts were raw, but they were also deeply attuned to John's physical condition. Max understood that this wasn't just a typical scenario. This wasn't about subduing an enemy or finding a scent trail. It was about keeping his partner alive. Max licked John's hand, his warm tongue brushing against the officer's cold skin. The officer's eyes fluttered, but the effort was too much. He couldn't fully open them. He was barely hanging on, his body failing him faster than Max could understand. Max continued to nudge him, using his snout to gently press against the officer's cheek, trying to rouse him. But the K-9's actions weren't yielding any results. A sudden shift in the air, a slight draft in the warehouse, caught Max's attention. His ears perked up, his body stiffening. Someone was coming. Help? Max didn't know if it was help or more danger, but the sound of footsteps told him there was someone, something, on the move. It wasn't the same footsteps he had been listening to before. These were different. The K-9's training kicked in once again. What would he do next? Max remained still, his body tense, ready to protect John. His eyes darted around the dark corners of the warehouse, scanning every movement, every shadow. As the footsteps grew louder, Max's fur bristled and he could feel his heart racing. He needed to make sure the officer was safe, and in this moment, there was no hesitation in his mind. He was ready to act. But as the steps neared, Max recognized them. It was another officer. Someone had finally come, someone who had heard his bark, someone who had realized the severity of the situation. Max stood still as the officer approached, but his gaze remained fixed on John. The second officer, a woman, was holding a medical bag in one hand and a radio in the other. She knelt beside John, her eyes widening in alarm as she took in the sight of his wounds. Without saying a word, she began to assess the situation. Max moved aside just enough to allow her to work, but he didn't leave his position. His nose stayed close to John's neck, his ears flicked back in a protective stance. Max felt the officer's pulse, still faint but steady enough for now. He could feel the woman's hands, quick and practiced, trying to stabilize the officer. "He's still with us," she muttered under her breath, her voice filled with a mix of relief and urgency. Max's body began to relax just slightly, but he still stayed close. His instincts told him not to leave John's side, not to let the officer slip away. The woman worked quickly, pulling out a clotting agent to stop the bleeding, but her focus never wavered. She knew the situation was critical. Every second mattered. Max's focus remained sharp, his instincts telling him that John was still hanging by a thread. The officer's wounds were severe, but Max could feel the slightest shift in his breathing. The K-9's bond with John told him that his partner wasn't going to give up, but would Max's efforts be enough to keep him alive until help could arrive? The tension in the air grew thick. With every passing moment, John's chances of survival seemed to dwindle. Max whined softly, unable to help any more than he already had. His presence was the only thing grounding the officer to this moment, reminding him that he wasn't alone. As the woman continued her work, Max let out another low growl, not in fear, but in a deep, protective instinct. What else could he do? What more could he offer in this moment? Everything hinged on the next few minutes. Would John survive, or had the wounds been too severe? Max's eyes never left his partner, and the dog's body remained stiff, ready to move at a moment's notice. There was no turning back now. The clock was ticking, and John's survival was in the balance. Would Max's instincts be enough to pull them through? Would they both make it out of this alive? Max's instincts were all that remained. His paws were planted firmly on the ground, his body still, but his mind was racing. He had never been trained for this exact situation. There were no drills, no lessons, no commands in the K9 handbook for how to save a partner when the odds were stacked so overwhelmingly high. The training he had received had always prepared him for danger, for capturing criminals, for protection, but nothing had prepared him for this. The officer was slipping away. John's breathing had become even more labored, his pulse weak, and the blood staining the concrete was a constant reminder that time was running out. Max stood close to him, his body trembling as he continued to nudge his handler's lifeless hand with his nose. His sharp brown eyes never left John's face, the steady rise and fall of his chest barely noticeable. Max had done everything he could. He had alerted by barking, licked his handler's face in a desperate attempt to rouse him, and tried to shield John from any further harm. But now, the K9 was faced with a choice. He knew he had to do something, anything, to save John. The sound of distant sirens slowly reached Max's ears, but they felt impossibly far away. Would they make it in time? Max had no way of knowing how much time was left, but his instincts told him one thing: he could not wait any longer. With his body tensed and his ears perked, Max looked around the warehouse. He scanned the area, assessing every corner, his sharp eyes searching for help. He had no idea where it would come from, but he knew he needed to alert someone. Anyone. Now. Max's gaze returned to John. His partner, his friend, was still breathing. Just barely. But barely wasn't enough. Max had been through countless operations, and he had never doubted his abilities to protect. But this was different. His mind was clouded with urgency, and there was a weight on his chest that made his stomach twist. Max let out a low, gut-wrenching growl as he took a step back from John, his chest tight with a sense of something deeper, a feeling of helplessness, followed by determination. Without thinking, Max barked. It wasn't the sharp, authoritative bark that had been drilled into him during his training. This was a sound born from desperation, from instinct, a sound that echoed through the cavernous empty space of the warehouse. Max barked again, louder this time, his voice full of urgency. The echoes rang off the walls, reverberating through the darkness of the warehouse. He didn't care who heard him. Someone had to come. But it wasn't enough to just bark. Max knew that. He needed action. He needed movement. He had to lead them here. Max turned sharply and bolted from the officer's side, his paws pounding against the floor as he ran through the warehouse. His legs were powerful and quick, driven by an animal instinct that guided him through the maze of metal beams and crates. His ears flopped with each stride as he bounded toward the nearest exit, toward the sound of the distant sirens, toward help. Max's heart was pounding, the sound of his own breath filling his ears. He knew John was fading, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't waste another second. He reached the exit of the warehouse and darted outside into the dimming light of the late afternoon. His sharp eyes scanned the area. He saw a pair of officers across the street, preparing to drive past, unaware of the chaos unfolding behind them. Max didn't hesitate. Max barked again, his voice rising in pitch and volume, unmistakably urgent. The two officers froze, their eyes immediately snapping to the K9. What was Max doing out here? Why was he so far from his handler? The officers recognized Max almost immediately. They had worked alongside him before, in other operations. But today, there was something different in the K9's stance, a new level of intensity. "Max!" one of the officers shouted, his voice filled with concern as he started toward the dog. "Where's Harris?" Max didn't wait for the officer to catch up. He bolted ahead, running in the direction of the warehouse where John lay dying. Come on, follow me, follow me." The officers hesitated for only a second before following Max, who had already turned back toward the warehouse. As they approached the entrance, Max darted inside again, stopping briefly to look over his shoulder to make sure the officers were behind him. Max's heart raced as he entered the warehouse once more. He could still hear John's faint breaths, each one more shallow than the last. Time was slipping through his paws like sand. The K-9's focus never wavered as he guided the officers toward John. The officers arrived just in time to see Max standing beside the fallen officer, his eyes locked on John's face, his body tense. The woman officer immediately knelt beside John, pulling out her medical kit. Max stepped back, keeping his watchful eyes trained on the scene. One of the officers immediately checked John's pulse. His expression faltered for a moment, but then he spoke urgently. "He's still alive, just barely. Get the tourniquet on him, now." Max stood just behind them, watching, his heart still racing, his ears flicking toward every movement. His paws itched to act, to be involved, but he knew his part was done. The K-9 had done everything in his power to bring them here, to save his partner. The officers worked quickly with precision and expertise. The tourniquet was applied and the bleeding slowed. The woman officer worked on stopping the internal bleeding while the other called for an emergency backup. "Stay with him," the officer said to Max, his voice low and steady. Max remained by John's side, never taking his eyes off him. He could still feel the faint pulse under his paws, and slowly he felt his tension ease. The sirens were growing louder now, signaling that the paramedics were on their way, but there was still a heavy question lingering in the air. Had they made it in time? The woman officer looked up at Max. Her eyes softened as she patted him gently. "Good boy. You did it." Max, though exhausted, stood proudly at John's side, his tail wagging weakly. His partner wasn't out of danger yet, but he had done what no one else could have. He had saved his handler's life. The rescue had come in time, and John's chances of survival had dramatically increased. But it had all been possible because of one thing: Max's incredible instinct to act. The tension still lingered in the air as they awaited the paramedics. But in that moment, Max knew. He had done what he was meant to do. Max stood there, his chest heaving with each breath, every muscle in his body strained with the urgency of the moment. The sound of John's shallow, ragged breaths seemed to echo in his ears, each one fainter than the last. Max's sharp senses picked up the tiniest movements of his partner, but the officer was slipping, his life hanging by a thread. Max had always been trained to track suspects, to defend his handler, and to respond to commands with precision, but nothing had prepared him for this. There was no manual for how to save a life, no instructions on what to do when the man who had been his partner for years was at death's door. Max was alone in this moment. He knew he couldn't just sit by and wait for help to arrive. John was fading too fast. The seconds felt like hours, the blood pooling beneath John's body a stark reminder of the urgency. Max's instincts screamed at him, "Do something." He paced back and forth, unable to comprehend the situation, but the need to act was undeniable. What could he do? Max's eyes darted around the warehouse, searching for any hint of assistance. There was nothing. The sirens were still distant, muffled by the steel walls of the building. The pain of helplessness gnawed at him, but Max refused to give in. He couldn't lose John, not like this. Max's mind raced. Then, without warning, he stopped. The sound. The bark. Max had an idea. Maybe this was his only option. With his tail stiff, his muscles tensed, Max took a deep breath and then he barked. It wasn't just a simple bark. This was the sharp, urgent bark of a K-9 in crisis, louder than anything he'd ever done before, one that rang through the empty warehouse with a sense of panic and desperation. He barked again, louder this time, echoing off the cold concrete walls. Max wasn't just trying to warn, he was trying to alert. The warehouse, silent and dark moments before, now reverberated with Max's call. His ears flicked forward as he listened intently for any response. His eyes scanned every corner of the space. No one had come yet, but they had to hear him. Max didn't stop. His voice filled the air, his barking frantic, wild, and full of the urgency he couldn't express in words. His instincts told him this was the only way. He had no idea who would hear him, but someone had to. Someone had to come. Max's bark became a signal, a desperate plea for help. It wasn't just noise, it was a call to anyone who could help John. The K9 continued barking relentlessly, his head turning from side to side, hoping that somewhere in the distance someone was listening. The K9 didn't stop, didn't pause for even a second. He had to make sure help was coming. Then Max paused. His ears perked. There it was, a faint sound, a rustle. Someone had heard him. The faintest of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Max's heart skipped a beat. It was someone coming. Max bolted toward the door, but stopped short. He turned back to John, his handler still unconscious on the cold ground. Max's eyes flicked between John and the approaching footsteps. He had to make sure they were coming for John. Max barked again. This time, it wasn't just a bark. It was a command. The K9 darted back toward the fallen officer, pacing beside him and urging the person approaching to hurry. He wasn't done yet. The footsteps grew louder, and Max felt a surge of hope. He had done it. He had managed to do what no one expected. The K9's instincts had guided him to alert the officers, but he had done something even more powerful. He had triggered a sequence of events that would ultimately save his handler's life. Max didn't wait for the officer to approach him. He ran back to John, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he stayed beside his handler, his body tense and ready. They were coming. They had to be. And then, as if on cue, a group of officers burst into the warehouse. Max's eyes darted to them, his ears flattening as he saw the familiar faces. It was help. Finally. The officers took one look at John and immediately sprang into action. "Get him stabilized now!" one of them shouted as he dropped to his knees beside the fallen officer. Max stepped back slightly, watching as the officers worked with precision and urgency. One of them checked John's pulse, his fingers working fast, his expression tense. "He's alive, just barely," the officer muttered, looking up at the other officers. "We need to stop the bleeding. Quickly." Max stayed close to John, watching with wide eyes as the officers worked frantically to save his partner. The K9's tail twitched nervously, but his body was still. He knew this was no time for hesitation. John needed him now more than ever. Max's body quivered with anticipation as the officers administered life-saving procedures. Time seemed to stretch on forever. The seconds dragged into what felt like hours. Would it be enough? Had they made it in time? The officers were moving quickly, applying tourniquets to stem the bleeding, preparing for the ambulance that was finally on its way. Max's gaze never left John, his ears flicking toward every sound, every movement. "Come on, Harris," one of the officers whispered, their voice full of concern as they worked. "Stay with us." Max's sharp gaze followed every action, every movement. But still, the tension hung in the air. It wasn't over yet. John was still unconscious, his life hanging by a thread. But Max had done everything in his power to get help. His instincts had guided him to act when no one else could. He had taken matters into his own paws, barking loudly and running for help, doing something that no one had thought possible for a K9. As the paramedics arrived moments later, they rushed into the warehouse, quickly taking over from the officers. Max watched as they worked, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The worst was over. His barking had triggered the events that had led to his handler's survival. He had called for help, and now it was here. The paramedics moved John onto a stretcher, his body still weak, but the bleeding had been controlled. Max stood beside him, never straying far from his partner. The K9's chest still heaved with effort, but he remained steady. He had done it. He had saved John's life. As the paramedics rushed John to the waiting ambulance, Max stood in the doorway of the warehouse, watching them disappear into the distance. He felt a sense of pride wash over him. He had acted. He had been the one to make a difference. The sirens grew fainter, and the K-9 remained, standing alone in the now silent warehouse, a hero in his own right. Max had done what no one thought possible. He had saved his partner's life. Max stood silently beside the ambulance, watching as his partner, Officer John Harris, was carefully loaded inside. The sirens wailed, fading into the distance, but Max remained rooted to the spot. His body still trembled from the adrenaline, his muscles sore from the relentless run to get help. The weight of the situation had begun to settle in, and the K-9 felt the exhaustion creeping into his bones. But amid the weariness, there was a profound sense of pride. He had done it. Max had acted when it mattered most. He had done what no one thought possible. He had saved his partner's life. Looking back at the warehouse where he had first found John lying unconscious and bleeding, Max felt a deep sense of loyalty to the officer who had been by his side through it all. John had always been more than just a handler. He had been Max's friend, his protector, his family, and in that moment of crisis, when time was running out and every second felt like a lifetime, Max had not hesitated. The bond between a police officer and his K-9 partner is more than just professional. It's a relationship built on trust, loyalty, and mutual understanding. Max had felt John's pain, his weakness, and his need for help, and he had acted on it instinctively. There was no thought, no hesitation, just the overwhelming need to save his partner. The K-9's actions weren't just a matter of training. They were a testament to the deep connection they shared. Max didn't need words. He didn't need commands. He knew what to do. He knew he had to act fast. He had to alert the officers, get them to the warehouse, and save John before it was too late. And he did. As the ambulance sped off toward the hospital, Max walked beside it, staying close to his partner, his eyes locked onto the vehicle. He was tired, but there was something else in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time: satisfaction. Max had done his job. He had saved the life of the one person who had always been there for him. When John finally regained consciousness, it wasn't in a hospital room alone. It was with Max lying faithfully at his side. The officer's eyes fluttered open, his mind groggy from the effects of the drugs and the exhaustion. But when he saw Max, a smile spread across his face. His first words were almost a whisper, but the depth of emotion in them was clear. "You saved my life, buddy," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You're my hero." Max's tail wagged weakly, the pride in his heart shining through. The bond between them had always been strong, but this moment solidified something even deeper. Max had been the one to act, the one who had responded to the call of duty when his handler was no longer able to. And John, recovering slowly but surely, knew that their partnership had changed forever. The days that followed were filled with hospital visits and rehabilitation. But for John, the road to recovery was made easier by the presence of Max. The officer had always known the value of his K-9 partner, but after the events of that day, the depth of their connection became undeniable. Max had saved his life, not because it was his job, but because of the bond they shared. Max's pride was immeasurable, but there was something else in his eyes, a sense of relief. His job wasn't just to protect. It was to ensure that John made it home, safe and alive. And for Max, that was the most important job of all. In the weeks that followed, the two were inseparable. John, though still recovering, knew that he owed his life to the dog that had always been by his side. The trust between them had been forged in the heat of danger, but it was strengthened in the quiet moments that followed. They had faced death together, but more importantly, they had faced it and conquered it together. The bond between a police officer and his K-9 partner is one of the strongest you can find. It is not just about commands or obedience. It is about loyalty, trust, and sacrifice. Max had proven that the connection between man and dog goes beyond anything words can describe. In the most crucial moment, Max had acted on pure instinct and saved John's life. And in that moment, their partnership became something more than professional. It became life-saving, unbreakable, and eternal. Max's bravery and loyalty in this incredible moment show us just how powerful the bond between a police officer and their K-9 partner can be. If you were moved by this heart-wrenching story, be sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of loyalty, courage, and heroism. Don't miss out on other inspiring stories. Hit that subscribe button to see what happens next.